You're listening to the Business Communicators.
Joining us now on the Business Communicators is Ron Carucci, the co-founder and managing partner at Navalent, working with CEOs and executives pursuing transformational change for their organization, leaders, and industries. And you can find Ron's work published everywhere from Forbes to Harvard Business Journal. And he is a best-selling author, and his latest work, To Be Honest, Lead with the Power of Truth, Justice, and Purpose, comes out May 25th, and you can pre-order that on Amazon right now. But Ron, thank you so much for joining us on the Business Communicators this week.
Austin and Hattie, thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you.
We're pretty excited to have you on the show, and I think your book is quite timely. And I think the reason for that is because of ESG. And I actually led a webinar and a conversation on that probably about a week and a half ago. And ESG has really become this hot button topic in the corporate space over the last 2 to 3 years. And for those that aren't familiar, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And investors are really increasingly applying these non-financial factors as part of their analysis process to identify, material risks and growth opportunities in companies. So I'm curious from your end, why was it important for you to maybe touch on these topics in your new book?
I didn't set out to write a book on honesty. That wasn't what my goal was. But when we got the research back, we use a really cool artificial intelligence, IBM Watson approach to analyzing the 15 years of data we were studying. So it was a longitudinal study of 3,200 leaders. But when the data came back, and so we decided not to give the data, go in with a typical hypothesis of let's prove this. We decided to see if the technology was really truly intelligent. We asked, tell us what the drill site should be. Tell us what we should be asking you. And when we got back these really interesting correlations between honesty and purpose and justice, we thought, oh, that's really fascinating. So we drilled deeper to isolate for the factors that could prove. I think, aren't we all tired of hearing the Wells Fargo story? Aren't we all tired of the Toronto story? Aren't we all just sick to death of Volkswagen stories? I thought, and I'm tired of hearing, well, it's the culture, or it was a few bad apples. It's just those are just insufficient explanations. And as our experience of leadership in every sector continues to be in a free fall, right? The standard of leadership goes up, of honesty goes up, because we just don't experience it enough. So I wanted to know, could we prove under what conditions people would behave fairly, tell the truth, and serve a greater good? And under what conditions would they lie, cheat, and serve their own interests first? And if we could prove it, could we prevent them? And so that's what we set out to prove, because I think people are tired of going to work and being their worst selves, feeling like they're atrophying, feeling like their souls are dying, feeling like they're not doing their best work, and not being proud of what they do, and tired of feeling like their companies are just treating them as if they're a cog in a wheel. And I had to believe that there were examples out there we could emulate. There were heroes out there whose stories we could tell, that we could copy, if we could prove that it's that companies are shaping these dynamics. These are not some random set of people showing up and deciding to be evil, that you can turn otherwise really smart and honest people into liars and cheats. And so it was very exciting when the data came back and we could statistically prove that there are 4 conditions under which you can influence the choices of people to go one way or the other. And you can create organizations of incredible purpose, great justice, dignity, and truth if you want to.
I'm a little curious about the type of people that were part of this, who gave you input or feedback on this. What did that look like? What was that makeup of leaders? Was it diverse? Was it not diverse? Where did you find the folks that you actually got your information from?
So there was 2 parts of the study. One was a series of longitudinal interviews. So over the last 15 years, 3,200 transcripts of leaders of all kinds and all walks of life all over the world are what we analyzed with our artificial intelligence to get the patterns and the statistical models of factors that could prove, or could predict behavior. But then I did a series of probably 40 or 50 in-depth interviews with all kinds of experts from many walks of life, very diverse in gender and race, in experience levels. Because one, I wanted to tell stories that were not just business stories. I wanted to tell stories that emulate the principles of honesty we found from another walk of life. Right? So we went to all of it. We went to Africa. We went to in the Congo. We went to LA. I went to Europe. I wanted these were heroes, right? So I was not extracting the bad data. I wanted to know the stories of people I'd be proud to emulate. So the book is really a book of heroes supported by data, of patterns and practices that we can all choose if we want to.
So, who are your heroes? Who are these people that you consider your heroes that you are asking this to? Can you give me an example?
Sure, Hubert Joly from Best Buy, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Marin Alsop, the leader of the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, Tiffany Jana, the diversity inclusion expert, Indra Nooyi, the former CEO of PepsiCo, Ryan Honeyman, who wrote the book about the B corporations, Jonathan Haidt, Amy Edmondson from Harvard. So one of the most interesting ones was one of my favorite interviews. So one of the chapters is about seams of organizations, right? So where there's rivalry in organizations, you're 6 times more likely to have people lie and cheat. So I wanted to know who from a really rough border had come together and figured out how to do it. So I found these 2 guys in LA who come from rival gangs. They come, one from the Crips, one from the Bloods, and who, by all accounts, should have either been dead or hated each other. Had come together and started a food business together. Still lived in their same hoods in the area, rough area of LA, but had this thriving business together. And so I went down and spent the day with them at their food business and interviewed them to hear their stories of why they did it, how they did it, and what it takes to take 2 people who might be set up to hate each other to get past that and decide to collaborate. And it was just an inspiring story. And so those are the kinds of stories I think there's plenty of business cases in the book. So that will for familiar context. But I think leaders need to go beyond the world they know and learn from places they would never get to visit.
We kind of spoke about this on the podcast 2 weeks ago about, companies and CEOs, whether they should step into these hot button political and social issues that are going on. And of course we use the Edelman Trust Barometer to show that, people are demanding that of their CEOs and leaders. And if we go one step further, there was actually a Morgan Stanley survey that was done in 2017 on sustainable living, and it surveyed actual active investors and found that 86% of millennials were interested in sustainable investing. And if you go even further, 90% of them say that they want sustainable investing as an option within their 401k plans. So my question for you is, why is this, accountability now just starting to take center at these corporations rather than, 4 years ago when this data actually came out?
Well, you have a convergence of forces, right? You have a pandemic that upended everything we know. You have certainly widespread levels of racial inequity that people are intolerant of, and you have just a sort of an almost finite level of tolerance now for corporate corruption. So the problem is in our corporations, you have these converging forces of people expecting to have a voice, a much more activated voice. You have inequity coming to a head where people don't want to be the privileged roles and the unprivileged roles. But you have the diversity and equity people sort of campaigning the way to justice. You have the marketers doing purpose washing to make it look like we have purpose. And you have the psychological safety experts saying, let's teach you how to create safety to speak up and tell the truth. Well, those are all interesting efforts. But what we found in our data was that definition of honesty has 3 parts. It actually is truth, justice, and purpose. It's not enough just to not lie anymore. People won't label you honest then. They might label you nice. But you have to say the right thing, do the right thing, and say and do the right thing for the right reason, even when it's hard. And that's what the standard of honesty has become. So suddenly now, where I put my money becomes really important. The great news is, if you look at, and we did this comprehensive look at the data, and my book is full of tons of proof that companies who are genuinely purpose-driven, their stock, and if you look at the ESG indices, those stock funds, they outperform the S&P by 14% or more. Consumers are far more loyal to brands who demonstrate that they're purpose-driven, not just look like it, but they actually do it. They're far more loyal to companies that treat them with respect, that are stakeholder driven. So employees are far more satisfied, more loyal to companies where purpose really is part of their story, and where they can marry their own purpose to the broader purpose. So, we don't need to look and wonder why it is these organizations are outperforming and doing well, and why their counterparts are not. I think you have a generation of people who don't want to. Even when you look at the Gen Zers, right? So all the millennials who complained about the Xers' behavior are now having all the things complained about them by the Zers, right? So it's not are you, it's which are you when. But the reality is people want to go to work and not leave their heart and soul and brain home. If there was ever a moment where suddenly there are no more boundaries between your home life and your work life, if there was ever a time when your colleagues and your bosses and your direct reports' personal lives became extremely relevant to you, it's when you're in their living room every day, seeing their dirty laundry and seeing their kids and seeing their homeschools. Those boundaries are gone. And for better or for worse, we did. Some people did well in how they managed it. Some people didn't. Our work life has now bled into everything because there's no boundaries anymore. That's a bad thing. But a wake-up call has happened. There are many reckonings happening now that you'll either be on the right side or wrong side of history in. I don't know that the pandemic caused it all, but I certainly think the pandemic revealed it.
I'm curious to know, any of all of the information that you received or feedback, was there anything there that surprised you?
One was the one I mentioned was the collaboration issue. So each of the four dimensions we learned in the research has a statistical predictor to it. Anywhere between 4 to 5 times or 3 to 4 times the likelihood that someone will behave honestly or dishonestly. The fact that cross-functional collaboration is a factor of 6 tells me that when you fragment the organization, you fragment the truth, which now you have dueling truths, right? So it's no longer about what the truth is; it's about who's right and how I make you wrong. I think that was such a large factor, was a big surprise to me. The other one was the issue of justice. The issue of we've been studying in the academic world. Well, I'm not. The academic world has been studying procedural fairness for decades, and its impact on ethical choices. And the minute somebody says the words "that's not fair," you set the stage for dishonesty, because when somebody feels wronged, they feel entitled to take. So, but the fact that dignity and justice are now so closely correlated, this was a sort of an interesting learning. I'm not sure I'd call it a surprise, but it was gratifying to learn. In a knowledge economy where the contribution and the contributor are so much more fused than ever. Used to be that I made 100 widgets a day, or repetitive work. My outputs were much more predictable. Today, my remit is my idea, my creativity, my analysis, my risky thought. What I'm paid for is so much more closely reflective of who I am, and we botched the process of making that connection. Right? Our accountability systems today are some of the most dehumanizing, inhuman processes. The process that should be the most dignifying, the most honoring, when we talk about my contribution, has become the one I dread, because I separate, in the purposes of objectivity, right? We separate the contribution and the contributor, which is insulting, because you as the contributor don't separate them. And so leaders now have to relearn processes of accountability by reinserting dignity and reinserting justice, because if everybody's chance to succeed is not the same, I feel unseen, I feel dangerous, I feel in danger. And so if I don't feel seen and known and equally able to succeed as other people, the process is not fair. And so I'm excited by the notion that we have to radically redefine the word accountability and what it means and how we practice it.
Talking about the accountability and the whole dynamic shift change, my question was more around, if I'm looking for a job or if I'm looking for employees, what are some of the red flags or green flags that, the questions you could ask or the answers you should be listening for to make sure that you don't wind up in an organization that is not good?
So I tell people all the time, you are not just looking for a job, you are hiring your next boss. So when hiring your boss, don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. Ask the question, when I make a mistake, how will you treat that? If I were to see somebody doing something who's practice I question the ethics of, how would my concern be received? What gets somebody fired here? If I were to walk around employees here and ask them what parts of working here aren't fair, what would they tell me? Ask the hard questions. Don't be so desperate to get chosen that you forfeit your own values and needs, because you will. What we did a lot of brain science to look at how does our brain work with honesty, and what we know is that we come hardwired to be honest. We're actually, our natural proclivity of the human brain is to be truthful, but place it in an environment where dishonesty is more accepted, you will succumb. Right? So, and there's no restore factory settings button on our brains. So we all, the road to the path to every slippery slope is paved with the words, well, at least I'm not as bad as. So don't forfeit the things that you hold sacred for the sake of getting a job. Ask the hard questions and make the boss worthy of hiring. Just as you're having to make yourself worthy for their hiring of you, you are hiring them to be your boss. You're trusting them to you with the next chapter of your career, with your development, with your dreams and aspirations. Make sure they're worthy of it.
I like that insight. And I think sometimes it's a little bit easier said than done when you go through, and sometimes maybe you've been employed for 6 months, 8 months, a year, and you really want that job and you don't want to ruffle any feathers to potentially, kind of limit yourself. But I think a great takeaway from what I just heard from you is you have to be honest with yourself. And sometimes I think it's something that we've discussed on this show is you have to be selfish sometimes and look out for number one. And that's okay to do that. You wrote a story, I guess an article in Forbes back in January, really encouraging 4 things. And it was be honest about your limitations, be honest about your relationships, be honest about your biases and privileges, and be honest about your deepest desires. And I think that's incredibly important because it's essentially telling me, be honest to yourself. Why is it important for us, whether we're in communications, whether in business, to be honest with ourselves?
Because most of us aren't, right? We have our own imposter syndrome. We have our own sense of insecurities. We're not taught, especially in Western culture in America, we're not taught to be honest about our desires. We're told that's selfish. We're told that's self-interested. People will judge you for it. And so we think by feigning self-deprecation or feigning humility or sacrifice, we come across as more virtuous. Well, that's just virtue signaling, right? Nobody benefits from that. And it's not even selfish to put your own interests in consideration when you're making a major career move. You're protecting the employer too. Giving them a version of you that's not a true one is just setting yourself and them up for failure later, right? So if you're not going to bring your most authentic self to their selection process, but you're going to give them an illusion of yourself, the one you want them to hire, you now have to keep that illusion up. And that's exhausting. And so, the less you can't, we all talk about wanting to be true to ourselves, but you can't be true to yourself until you are true about yourself.
It's interesting that you say we should be bringing our true, authentic selves to work. Last week, I interviewed Jody Ann Bernay, who has a TEDx out there about there's a myth about bringing your true, authentic self to work because of how you may be interpreted, how you may be looked at. And I can't speak for anybody else, but if I were to bring my true, authentic self to work, I don't think it would be received well. Because I know how my personality is, and I know how also some people may not have that certain types of response. I also find myself having to put disclaimers in front of sentences before I say this, say in terms of no disrespect intended, however, or no offense, and then move on. Because what I'm going to say is going to be perceived as offensive or disrespectful to someone based on their fact that they don't know me, they're not trying to know me, or they are not sure of the tone of the approach or how to interpret it.
Patty, do you feel like that's not by doing those qualifications, that's not being yourself, or is it just making sure that what you say can be heard?
It's not being myself. So I have I don't believe in imposter syndrome as far as I'm concerned. There's no such thing. I am who I am. However, when I am working with certain people, if I'm working in a certain type of workplace, or if I'm sitting at a table and I'm reading my room, yes, I'm going to say that because people are not prepared in a certain way.
And I can kind of jump in on this because I worked with Hattie for several years at a company that we both left in January. And I have the professional friendship and relationship with Hattie. And then I have the personal friendship and relationship with Hattie. And I don't want to say that they're two completely separate people, but you can definitely see a difference in tone and email conversation, in the corporate world, when she's sending a group message or responding to something on Yammer versus what we have in our WhatsApp thread for this podcast. It's completely different. And I love and respect Hattie for who she is, the honest person where sometimes I look at my phone and realize we've had a 2-hour conversation. And I don't feel that this is just my opinion, I don't feel that, like, at least when we work together, that she always felt comfortable being her true self. And I totally understand where she's coming from on, her question to you.
And to build on that, it's not about being uncomfortable, but it's about not making the other person uncomfortable because of their sensitivities or how they receive information.
There's a continuum of authenticity versus hiding or self-editing, right? Now, I find myself in a variety of different professional settings, in a variety of different cultures. And so there's a part of me that's required to be effective, to adapt, right? If I'm in New York, I can go, what the hell is, but if I'm in Seattle, I can't do that. Now, the question then becomes is, do I withhold my feedback or do I find a way to make it receptive, right? I don't see that as not being myself. I see that as making myself able to be effective in my job where I am.
That's different. But I'm gonna come out here and say it. You're a white man. You can be comfortable in any setting and adjust. We role play too. I role play. I have to role play. We all role play. That's very different to me.
I fully respect, Hattie, that as a Black woman, you have way more stacked against you. It'll be out in probably a few weeks. My interview with Tiffany Jana. In my episode of Moments of Truth, the show I do online, she talks about, as a Black woman, what it means to show up as herself and what it doesn't mean, and how and what that means for her, and all the biases about people's perception of strong, convicted, passionate women and how that gets interpreted in the wrong ways. So I have deep respect for that. You have biases to deal with that I never will. I get all the privileges that come with my gender and my skin color that I don't have to think about that you do. So I want to say I respect that. I think for every one of us, the question we have to ask ourselves is, where is that line between adapting and hiding? And I don't know that it's a single point on a line. I think it's a blurry one. But I think if you are spending more time hiding than adapting, first of all, your mental health will suffer. You'll notice it, right? You'll be depressed, you'll be anxious, you'll not be at ease, and you'll start doing all kinds of dark, bad behaviors. If the adapting to a culture, a corporate culture, is one that's you can be effective at it, but it's exhausting. It's probably a mismatched place to be working. But I think the notion of let it all out is not about being your true self. That's just not being self-aware, right? You have to read the room. You have to know your audience. You have to understand where you're at. So the process of editing and tempering versus hiding and concealing becomes a continuum. And I think that's a personal choice for every one of us to make peace with. I do think in today's workplaces, far more people make peace with hiding, especially if they have some type of identity diversity that they're not sure will be accepted well, or their voice hasn't been welcomed, right? So I think it's a problem. because you're paying these. If you're an employer and you're paying people to bring you if their emit is their ideas, their creativity, their passion. Why, for goodness sake, would you not want to do everything you possibly can to create an environment where they're free to bring, in a professional, appropriate way, bring it all? And if you're not, that's just dumb. That's, completely dumb. And you know what? God bless you, leaders. That you intend for it to be that way is irrelevant. Intending for it to be that way because you think you are versus doing all the hard work to make it that way, different things. You don't get credit for your good intentions. You either do the work to create the environment that allows that to happen, or by default, it's not natural. It won't happen. So you declaring this is a safe place for dangerous truths, this is a safe place to be you, is very interesting and makes a lovely poster on the wall. You actually ensuring that all your systems and processes and ways of being in your organization and your leaders who lead all your people are doing the things it takes to have that happen is a very different thing. And if you think the wave of your hand or the declaration of your voice is what is going to make that happen, then you're just naive. And you're actually causing more harm, because the fact that you say it and then don't make it happen makes you a hypocrite and it hurts people.
I think that's going to be one of the interesting things to follow with companies, corporations, and CEOs. It's like, are they just saying things to say things? Or are they actually going to say things and have results, have actions, have a plan?
We're seeing all the purpose washers.
Yep.
After last year and George Floyd, we're seeing all the black washers, right? And they all can know there are strong statements about racial equity. People are now saying, not soon after, people are now saying, show me the goods.
Yeah.
Or don't, but shut up.
Yeah, and again, Hattie referenced Jodi Ann Beret on the podcast last week, and she said a lot of communications teams are ill-equipped to talk about racial equity and social justice, and I think that's a very fair point. I think that's very fair with companies as well. But kind of closing this out, in the Forbes article, when you talked about being honest about your biases and privileges, I think this is something you kind of touched on just a few moments ago, but you said 2020 invited us all to examine our contributions to these challenges by being more honest about our biases and privileges, especially the ones we're certain we don't have. And you kind of posed a few questions. You said, if you lead a team, who have you even unconsciously favored? Who is your they? Who have you othered because of a difference in values, personality, or identity? And then you close it by saying this: in 2021, let's make our theys part of we's, and let's do what we can to share the privileges we enjoy with those who don't. So whether you're at the C-suite level or whether you're an individual contributor, how can we work together to make sure that we are creating this inclusive environment, regardless of what the company says on a corporate poster that might end up in the cafeteria?
Well, first of all, thanks for reading that quote. I forgot about that article. Here's the thing. So the last two chapters of To Be Honest, that open with the story that you're getting was, the chapter's called Make Your They Part of You. It's all the way to do what you're describing. If you're not honest about having a they, there's nowhere to start, right? You have a they. Everyone does. Doesn't make you evil, doesn't make you bad, doesn't make you ill-intended. Just makes you honest. The question is, who is in your echo chamber and who's not? Look at yourself. If I were to examine your social media feed for one day, I could tell you who all your theys are, just by whose voices you're not hearing. And so if you're not willing to be honest about who you have a cognitive or intellectual or other bias about, whether it's an identity bias or a functional bias or a skill bias or an education bias, you're just blind. What it absolutely means for sure is, if you can't name within 3 seconds who your they is and why, here's what you have to assume. First of all, you're blind. But what that means is that blindness is two ways. You don't see who you're being othered by. You don't see whose they you are. Because if you think you're not a pain in somebody's ass, then you're really naive, right? So you are missing out on critical relationships. There are stakeholders who need to be in your network for you to be successful in that organization that are not. And you know when you're going to find out who your they is or whose they you are? When there's a crisis. When you hit a wall, when somebody in your team screws up, when there's an emergency or a massive budget cut, you are going to watch the rats exit your ship. So don't wait till that happens. Figure out your critical stakeholders now, figure out who the theys are, and go fix those relationships. And start with an apology if you have to.
Absolutely love it. Ron, I really appreciate your insights and your perspective that you've shared with us on the podcast. And again, you've got a book coming out May 25th. You can pre-order it on Amazon. It's To Be Honest, Lead with the Power of Truth, Justice, and Purpose. And for our listeners out there, maybe if they want to pick up the book or if they want to get in touch with you and just kind of follow the work that you're doing, I guess this is your time to plug yourself and what you have going on, how they can connect with you.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. You guys have been fun to chat with, so thanks so much for having me. So you can visit our website at Navalent, Navalent.com. If you want to, there's a great new funky assessment tool called How Honest Is My Team? So if you want to know, are people telling you the truth or not, you can come to navalent.com/assessment and download based on the research in the book and figure out who's showing up to my team honestly. The book has a website called tobehonest.net. And you can find episodes of our television show called Moments of Truth, where you see all the interviews of my heroes, a video webinar series you can watch, a bunch of articles. So you can pre-order the book. Please, pre-orders help, so please pre-order.
We'll drop everything in the show notes below, so you can definitely contact Ron, pick up his book, pre-order it. I know that definitely helps out. And it's kind of fun when you pre-order books sometimes. I actually pre-ordered Tony Bourdain's book, his final book, I guess, last January, and it arrived probably about a week and a half ago, and it was a pleasant surprise to see it in my mailbox. So highly encourage you guys to pre-order books. But Ron, thank you so much for joining us on the Business Communicators.
Austin, Hattie, Thomas, a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Business Communicators.